This is my song, O God of all the nations, a song of peace for lands afar and wide.
This is Marjohn Love, and this is Marjohn's Musings. Hi, we're back, and I wanted to show you the very first thing I want you to do if you're going to dye silk. Get yourself a pair of cotton gloves. You can get them at Crosby's. Put your cotton gloves on first. The reason for that, I don't know about you, but I don't like the feeling of sweaty hands inside gloves. And you always glove up. I hate gloves. I'd rather not use gloves. I'm telling you, you get this dye in your skin, it's there for days. And the way you get it back out again is you shampoo your hair 2 or 3 times, and finally you have a pastel green thumb instead of a brilliant green thumb. So the first glove is easy. The second glove, not so much. I always try to line the fingers up and then squunch the plastic or the rubber gloves. I'm latex sensitive, so I can't do latex gloves. I do hypoallergic kind. When you get your gloves on, the first thing you have to do with that beautiful silk scarf, okay, this one's a 14 by 54, is you wash it in a mild solution of a pretty standard detergent. You can buy this stuff called Synthropol. Make sure you give it a good soak, usually about 3 minutes. In the meantime, soak your brushes in water. They'll absorb less dye. They'll have less wear and tear on the fibers of the brush. You won't muddy up your colors. Every once in a while, even though I've washed my brushes before I put them away, I go to put them in the rinse and pink comes out or purple comes out. I told you about the different types of colors. This one here is the one they recommend, the yellow. It's one of the primaries, and I've already poured it out into a little cup. You need enough liquid volume that you can actually cover your scarf. When I first started, I used an eyedropper, and they're inexpensive, and it works really well. You may even have one laying around. This color is cyan, but because the dyes are very concentrated and intense, how would you know that? You look at these colors laid out, and my teacher, Stephen Bates, told me, you can't tell what a color is sitting inside the container. So my very first color, I think, is going to be this cyan blue. It's good to have 3 containers of water. 1 for blues, 1 for reds, and 1 for yellow all by itself. It's very easy to contaminate your yellow and not have a nice clear yellow. We're coming up on St. Patrick's Day, and I wanted to do something with green. I recently bought myself Viridian green and Kelly green. And my brushes are all rinsed and ready to go. And my silk's been soaking while I was chatting. You don't need to be aggressive with it. Just rinse it out in the soapy water. And then rinse it and clear. So once you've washed and rinsed the silk, the next thing you have to do is you have to stretch it on the stretcher, and that takes a little bit of doing. So the next step in the process, you need some sort of a rubber band. I'm using clips today, but I'm going to show you another method. The reason that I'm using clips is because they're great for beginners. So in order to do the knot, you take the clip. Now I got these at the dollar store up by Marshall's, Family Dollar, and they were a 10-pack for $1. The trick with these, after a while they rust, so you have to check the condition of them every time you work with them. And when you're done dyeing, you have to wash them. And as you dye a scarf, if you don't open the clip and move it down the silk and paint underneath it, you'll have a white spot. But I wanted to show you, it's just a simple lark's head knot. So I have these set up for you so you don't have to watch me do 20 of them. And 20 sounds like a lot. Sometimes 20 is not enough. So what I've done is I've taken 2 rubber bands and I've got lark's head's knot from the rubber band to the next rubber band and take it around the pole, poke it through the hole, and snug it up. And you work in pairs so that when you're going to stretch the silk, you work in pairs. Now normally I'm not inside the frame, but because of the way we have to angle the cameras in the studio, I'm in the frame so you can see what I'm doing. So I've got 3 on this end. Sometimes you need 4. I've got 3 on this end, and I've got my wet silk. It's good to start at the ends if you can, and you attach the silk to the clip at the hem. And then you have to remember later that when you're applying the dye, you need to move the clip aside so that the dye goes underneath the clip. Then you stretch out your silk. Try not to get it on the ground or the tabletop or whatever, and bring it down to the other end. I'm down the other end of the silk. I'm going to try to space these a little asymmetrically. And the reason that I want to do that is if you have them lined up perfectly opposite one another, the silk gets stretched in such a way that there's lines of tension down the fabric. Now this is a little bit loose. If I was at home and I had the luxury of time, I would trade out these rubber bands for smaller rubber bands. Let's try this one, because this one's too long and doubling it made it too short. Some of this is a matter of trial and error. A lot of error, especially in the beginning. So you have to be a little patient with yourself. And that's about right. That's not too bad. So we'll be back in a few minutes because I don't think you need to watch me clip all the silk all the way along. I think that gets kind of boring. The idea is there. You just come along and clip the silk, and then you go back on the other side and try not to get them precisely opposite. Otherwise you'll strain your silk, and then when you go to paint it, you'll be able to see those strain lines. This stuff stains, which is why I'm wearing old funky clothes today. Wear clothes you don't care about to do silk dyeing because you will get some on yourself. One of the things that's kind of fun about silk painting is all the different techniques people have thought of to make a variance in the color. This is, get ready for this, vodka. I learned this on the internet, and I'm going to put lines of vodka down on the silk, and then I'm going to go over that area with cyan blue. Cyan is one of those 3 basic colors that we talked about. Before I do that, I'm going to duck over here a second. I'll be right back. And I'm going to put my gloves on. So hi, Minnie Mouse is back. I have some cyan blue, and I have put alcohol on the silk. I wanted you to be able to see what happens with the cyan blue near the alcohol or where there is no alcohol. Now this silk is still wet from the washing. And now I'm going to go over the alcohol and see how the dye beads up a little bit. It's sort of, it doesn't take quite the same. It's more pastel where you put the vodka than where you didn't put the vodka. Anytime you make a mark on silk, it leaves a pattern. So you have to be kind of careful about what you're doing with the silk. Now remember I told you about those clips. If you want a consistent blue without white edges, you have to slide the clip sideways in order to get that. This is just a demo piece, and I'm not that fussy about it right now. I'm just trying to give you the basics. So I'm not going to bother to move all those clips today, but if you were doing a scarf that you wanted to keep for yourself or give as a gift, you need to move the clips. I told you on a prior show, I learned from this lady on the internet that she felt yellow was the bully of the colors. So let's see what happens when we put yellow next to that blue. And like I told you before, the silk is a fiber that came from a living creature. It's not like cotton or linen. It came from this caterpillar, and it seems to have a bit of a mind of its own. As I'm painting along, I'm playing with the color, trying to see what is it going to do. So I now have a yellow swatch and this odd little glyph. How about we add a geometric? There's a different yellow than regular yellow. It's called citron. And I probably should have started with that one. It's a lemony yellow and it's a bit lighter than the full yellow. It acts a little different and it looks different on the silk. I don't know if you can tell with the studio lighting, but they're not the same color. The citron is a little different. The one reminds me of well-fed chicken egg yolk yellow. This is a trick I learned. If the silk looks like it's going to have a blob of color, you can sometimes fix that by going underneath and working with the drips from the bottom of the silk, which is nice to have it suspended where you can actually work on it. I have bed risers at home that I put the frame on because, as you can see, this frame is not real stable. It's more stable on a tabletop. While that's still wet, I'm going to go into it with some red. The red that's recommended in the Jacquard starter kit is magenta, which is a brilliant pinky purple red. The one I'm using today is called Carmine. It has a different hue. And I'm going to put it in with the citron, but I'm also going to put it in with the yellow. And they're a little different, they act different. And if you watch, you can see it feathering. It moves, the color moves. So since we have a triangle, how about we make a square shape? And we have some dots. Let's pick up some dots to make the design sort of have a little bit of continuity, even though it's very free form at this point. I don't know if you can see, but the dye crept up the hemmed edge. Now this particular scarf is machine hemmed. There's a more expensive scarf that's got a rolled hem. Those are done by hand by ladies in China, and it takes hours. I bought a foot for my sewing machine so that if this takes off and I start to sell them, because you can make as many as you want, but if you don't sell them, what are you doing it for? Now I have red and I have yellow. If I wanted to make an orange, all I have to do is put a little red into my yellow. I didn't buy an orange. There are 3 oranges available. One is a scarlet, it tends toward red. One is poppy, which comes out more orange. And one is called apricot. I didn't really like it at first, but I like it a lot now. It has a beautiful, deep golden tone. And I don't know if you can see, but there's drips coming through. And if I go back under there, and what happened was I overloaded the brush, so I didn't wipe the brush, and that's how I got that drip. If I don't want that to make a dark mark in the fabric, I have to then go back and smooth it out. So I have this lovely deep orange color. If I brush it back over the carmine in some spots, but not others, I'll get a third color, a different color. And I'm going to go back in here and see what happens with this slightly different color. And right now they look very similar, but after they're steamed, which sets the dye, and we didn't talk a whole lot about the steaming process, but this particular type of dye is a jacquard red label, and it should be steamed rather than ironed. Now I talked to you a little bit about salt technique. The rock salt that I bought had sand in it. I was like, wait a minute, you said rock salt. You didn't say rock salt with sand. So I'm going to sprinkle salt on here. And what it will do, if you put it on while the silk is wet, it's what they call hydrophilic. The salt will pull the dye and the water toward itself and make a little stellar pattern. We're going to switch to greens now because we're coming up on St. Patrick's Day, and I, in honor of St. Patrick's Day, purchased myself some green. So this one here is Viridian. And I'm going to leave the cyan blue in the brush and let them mix a little. So I'm dipping the end, wiping the extra, and leaving the blue on the brush. What that does is it gives me a two-tone effect. We're going to go back over that with kosher salt in a minute so that you can see the difference between a large grain salt and see, I have that pastel cyan now. And the reason it's pastel is I soaked my brush first in water. If you have a hemmed piece, it's a really good idea to go back under and over the edge of the hem so that you don't get white holidays of color unless you want them. So even though that might look like there's a gap, because of the cyan in the brush, there's actually blue in that stripe. Now that green was Viridian. I'm curious about the difference between the Viridian and the new one I bought, which is called Kelly Green. So I'm going to rinse all the other dye out of the brush to the best of my ability. If I was home, I'd probably wash it out in the sink. And it's probably a good idea with a brush this size to squeeze the dye out. So this is my Kelly Green. And I got it just for this show. I had been mixing my own greens, and I realized I went through a lot of yellow that way. And I thought, you know, I really like yellow. If I use all my yellow, I won't have any when I need it. Now the technique that I'm using here is called watercolor technique. I haven't actually done a resist. So this is a Ralph Lauren skirt done in watercolor technique. They started out with a turquoise, they went ecru, then they went olive, then they went ecru again, sky blue, more turquoise, more ecru, and more olive. And they let it drip. I wanted to show you what the resist does. So I have here two kinds of resist, one in copper, in the tube, water-based resist. And I'm going to make my triangle and my square in two different kinds of resist. So this one is the copper. Now, in the books, they tell you that you should let that dry completely before you paint over it. But I think my poor director and Jimmy, my cameraman, would get a little aggravated with me if I made them stay here for an hour. So here's my copper, and I'm going to do a contrast so that you can see what happens with the resist. If you've noticed, I put a drop cloth down, and I did that on purpose. Now we're going to switch to a sky blue and a different type of brush. I've been using natural bristle brushes. This one is a less expensive acrylic one. And I'm not sure that the gutta has set long enough, but we'll try. The trick is to not go all the way to the edge. They call the gutta a fence. This particular color is Sapphire Blue. And see, I didn't let it sit quite long enough, and it's creeping out the edges of my circle. The trick with this is to go close to the edge, but not up to it. If you come too close to the edge with a loaded brush, the dye will jump the fence. So you bring it close, but not quite to the edge. And what that does is it gives you, okay, so here I have thick and thin. I wasn't real consistent. It's very likely to jump the gap at the thin. We'll see. That didn't set up long enough. So it's buzzing through. The trick is when you see something like that, try to use it to your advantage, because silk has a bit of unpredictability to it, and you have to embrace that or you'll make yourself crazy. It's not a controlled medium like some of the others. So I'm going to switch over here, and I've got a different blue. I have no idea how these two blues will interact. This one, I think, is my cyan, and I'm going to go ahead and put it around that one that's leaking. I didn't give that long enough to cure. The other thing is, if you're at home and you have time, you should wait for the gutta to dry and then look at it underneath. Flip your frame over and make sure that it went all the way through the fibers. If it didn't, you'll have this breakthrough problem. But because I didn't wash my brush between the two blues, I've got a natural blending going on here, and I kind of like that. That's not too bad. So where the resist line was thick, the blue stayed in the square, and where the resist line was thin, it broke through. I'm going to pick up my orange, and I'm going to try that around this blue. A lot of what happens with silk is about the juxtaposition of color. So one color will look different when it's next to a different color. So I'm going to put it next to this blue, and then I'm going to bring it back toward this green. And now I know you can see that that green crept down the hem. See how it walked all by itself? It didn't wait for me. I really should have blown this with a hairdryer. But I feel like I'm taxing my friends here at Cape Ann TV because we've been at this all day. So I'm not going to paint anymore. I want you to watch. See, it's bridging my resist line because I didn't let it dry properly. And that's just because I'm rushing. I'm curious if this will come out mud brown or whether it'll come out purple. I've got a little blend here. I have no idea what it's going to do. Part of the fun of silk painting is that you discover stuff as you work with it. It came out sort of a strange dark gray. I don't know what it'll look like when it's steamed. Sometimes it comes out much prettier than you think. But I've watched people with the resist do 2 and 3 and 4 days of putting the resist down and then letting it set up overnight. And when you do it correctly, it actually does hold the color in the lines. And I can show you a close-up of that on my professionally made scarf. I didn't wait long enough, and I've got bleed through all over the place. So instead of stressing out about it, I'm going to take my red pour it into the orange and see what I get with this. Do I get a complementary shade? Do I get a clashing shade? I don't know. I'm just playing here. And at the moment, I can't really tell the difference, but there will be a difference. Now, when you use the metallic resists, they stay in the fabric. If you use a clear resist, after you steam the silk and you wash it, the resist comes out, it's gone. So you don't feel that edge. But the metallic resists, oops. And if you're watching, you can see how the dye kind of goes where it wants to. That was a little frustrating for me in the beginning. I was like, whoa, wait a minute, that's not where I put you. And everybody told me, well, that's the nature of silk, and you have to get used to that. So I'm going to add just a dot of this to my yellow to make a really more orangey color. I have red in the brush. And I'm going to come back over here by the green. And I'm going to pick up along this hemline. There's a bubble there. Now, putting that little bit of carmine into the yellow brought out like that apricot color I talked to you about. You can actually buy that by the bottle, and it's really kind of nice. It's a very rich, warm color. So I'm not going to go all the way up to the green at the moment. I'm going to see, will they touch one another or not? If you want them to, they don't. And if you don't want them to, they will. Or at least that's been my experience. And I'm sorry I'm not looking at you. I'm kind of paying attention to what I'm doing. Like talking about stuff is one thing and doing it is something else. There are people who are very meticulous, who when they make a color, actually make index cards. And they take a piece of scrap silk, because these folks tend to be the professionals who are selling their silk products. And they put that color on the silk that they're using, and they make like a recipe card, so that they know how to make that exact same shade again. So I'm going to go back to my Viridian, but this time I'm going to dump in clear yellow. And I'm going to see what does that do. I probably should have gone the other way, because this is apt to be subtle. If you're going to mix colors, always add the dark to the light, I think. Yeah, so it's a different shade than it was before, which is kind of fun. Now, Stephen keeps telling me, so I'm going to demonstrate so he knows I was paying attention. You load the brush. You wipe the excess off the brush. You put the brush on the silk. You move slowly. You do not lift the brush. And the reason for that is if you pick the brush up too much, you get little dots of color that splash off the silk. And he's like, so you turn the brush and roll the brush, but you don't actually pick it up. That's why I have all these little dots, because I picked mine up. And because my metallic resist is still wet, I'm getting little streaks of gold. I'm not sure that I dislike it. Like, some of what happens with this is a little bit of serendipity. Like, what happens if I take the green and gold and come down here? And I don't know until I try. So part of the fun of this for me is the discovery. I'm in my 60s. If you can teach me something new, I'm all for it. And I'm going to show you that trick I told you about. So if I want the green to go the entire way, I have to actually move the clip. If I don't move the clip, I'm at very grave risk of having a white space that I may not want. And then we're going to go back over this wet part with kosher salt, which is not as big as that sea salt. So it'll give a slightly different effect. I wasn't able to find flowered salt. You can find that at places that cater to artisanal bread makers. But I haven't found a shop like that here. So I have this corner. I'm going to remove the clip, dye the silk, and then pull it back. And that's how you do it. If you need to be careful and you want to make sure you got that green everywhere, you lift the clip and check underneath. This one has a little spot of white. And that's considered a defect. Like if somebody saw your silk scarf and they saw that, they'd think, oh, you're an amateur. You didn't know to move the clip. What do you think? Should there be green anywhere else? I think right here. That didn't flow quite as well as I would have liked. Right there. Now, if you go back into silk that's already dry, you get what's called a grackle edge. Let's see if I can make one for you. I don't know if that's going to be a grackle edge or not, but if I come down here where I threw the salt a few minutes ago, I bet I can make a grackle edge, which is something that you don't really want usually. So if you come into an area that you've worked in before and it's completely dry, you can get a hard edge. And that's also considered a fault. So we'll see if this makes hard edges or not. And the trick to having a fun piece is sometimes just letting yourself be a kid again. Like if I was a little kid and this was finger paint, what would I do next? It's kind of an interesting thing to just, up in the studio, they have this thing, go with the flow. And they mean it, because depending on how you take this, you can get yourself really frustrated. Or you can go, wow, how cool is that? And it's all a matter of attitude, because like I told you, it's not predictable. That's wet on wet silk painting with salt. I'm going to put a little bit of salt where we had the orange. Now see, these grains are much finer, so they're going to make a different sort of a pattern than those big grains. And I'll show you a close-up of the scarf afterwards so you can see how the technique changed. Here's my grackle edge. Maybe I can kind of dolly that up so it looks like it was intentional. If ever you have a situation where, uh-oh, something happened, look at that with a open mind and go, you know, if I wanted that to happen, how would I want it to be? It's kind of a different way of thinking about things. So that's the end of my salt. And there is a very bright, colorful scarf. So, there's another type of a technique that you can use, and I'm sure you've done this in school. I got a hold of a lovely cross, and it's textured, very heavily textured. What I did is I placed it underneath the silk, then I rubbed that with Derwent Inktense sticks. This is a 24 color set of Derwent Inktense pencils. I have an atomizer bottle here of water, and I'm just going to spray down my cross because until it gets wet, the Inktense pencil is not liquid enough to actually dye the silk. Now I don't want to overdo that. I'm going to let that rest. Now why did I show you another silk? Well, this one is mounted differently, and it has been pre-treated with an anti-fusant called No Flow. So what I'm doing right now is I'm brushing on a very pale pastel tone of citron with a brush that has a slight bit of cyan in it. You can see that the edges are not spreading like they did without the No Flow. They're pretty crisp. The edges are staying right where you put them, like on my silk fan. And that's kind of what I was exploring. I wanted to see what would happen with the No Flow. So we're going to leave that alone a minute, and we're going to find out, does it hold the shape, or does the shape shift like it did on the other one? I'm going to use the Cyan Blue. And I'm doing what's known as dry brushing. I'm only touching the very tip of this to the dye and then letting the brush run dry so that I get to see, does the dye stay where I put it? And it really seems to. So how about I come along my edge, and this time I've used hooks. The reason I didn't show you them at first is this set of hooks was $20 some odd plus tax plus shipping and handling. So if you're a beginner, you don't need to buy these hooks. The other thing is these hooks bite. They actually bite you. So you have to be very careful with them or you can get hurt. I got a gash that took 2 weeks to heal because I wasn't paying attention. But they have little points. The other thing is you need, just like with the clips, when you're done your silk project, you need to wash them thoroughly. So I'm finding that I'm enjoying painting on this surface. It's almost like paper now. The dye does not seem to move much past where I put it. And I have a sense of control that I don't have on the untreated silk. So this is another step. It's called no flow. It's made by Jacquard, and you sponge or brush it on, and then you have to let it dry completely before you go back and paint on it. Let's peek at the yellow. Did it move? And I can't see that it did. It doesn't seem to have moved at all. Although where I sprayed the water, the ink tints is blurring slightly. So that's kind of interesting to know. So there you have the demonstration. We have anti-fusant, non-fusant, no flow, and dry brush technique where it didn't move at all. And then we have dry application with ink tank sticks, and we had salt. And we also had alcohol. That was the light patches. And I will show you in the closing credits what the two scarves look like when they came out. That's all for now. This is Marjohn, and this has been Marjohn's Musings.